Yeah, wow. I mean, January 6th was nothing compared to this.
It's not a contest.
No, it's not a contest. It feels a little bit like Eisenstein. You know, the masses are just in motion. And, I mean, you get this sense that, you know, about, in general, of sort of political disengagement in the country at some level, in terms of but what you see here is really deeply principled, deep conviction, just pushing through. And I think it's, you know, it's a remarkable document, very dramatic. But maybe we could just start with what drew you to the project. How long did it take? There are a total of 8 episodes.
Eight episodes. Yeah.
So check it out if you haven't seen it, the rest of it.
It's on phillyda.tv if you want links to find the other episodes.
Yeah. So what drew you to the project?
Well, yeah, I'll just start off and say, again, I'm just one of the 2 co-directors with Ted Passon and Nicole Salazar, who's our producer. And I also just want to quickly just acknowledge my wife and kids, Moses and Lev, who are here, who I couldn't have made this film without you guys, so thank you for your patience. And I also want to acknowledge that in the beginning of the film, there's a montage of a lot of protesters who really galvanized a lot of the movement to elect Larry Krasner. And there's a shot of a young man standing in front of the district attorney's office saying, this election is more important than the presidential election in our community. So it speaks to your issue of, you know, how central local politics are, and unfortunately, even elections like this don't get enough turnout. But the reason I mentioned that moment is just to acknowledge that Joshua Glenn is the name of that activist who died last week, and today is his funeral, so I just want to mention him. And he's really important to the series because part of why we had 8 episodes is that later in the series, this guy who protested on behalf to elect Larry Krasner goes into the office and tells Larry Krasner, you're letting my community down, you're not doing enough. So I think we wanted to really show the arc of change and how hard it is to make change. And that's really important to show how hard it is.
It comes across completely.
Oh, so you asked me how it got started. I didn't
no. I mean, we can follow up on this. I mean, first of all, the style of filmmaking is primarily close observation, direct cinema. And is that something that is what you pursue, generally speaking? Is what you prefer to do? I mean, Frederick Wiseman has sort of pioneered that area, the Maisels, although Wiseman's been so prolific. I'm sure that was some inspiration to your work, yes?
Yeah, I love all those direct cinema, observational cinema, neorealist cinema, whether it's fiction or documentary. I'm all for it, and I think it had always been like a fantasy to make a longitudinal film where you could tell a story by observing people. And this film and docuseries happened kind of by accident in a way. We never tried to make a docuseries. Certainly the last thing I would want to do is make 8 hours of anything. To subject anybody to that. But my co-director, Ted Passon, has lived in Philadelphia for 30 years, and I'm a relatively recent transplant living in Philadelphia, and he had been very active in the activist space and knew a lot of those folks who had been protesting for change for generations. And when he heard that Larry Krasner was running, Larry Krasner was the guy you would write his phone number on your arm in Sharpie so that when you were arrested at a protest, he would be the one to call to help you get out. When he heard he was running, I think Ted thought it was kind of a stunt and a joke. And so Ted asked me to start filming the campaign to make a short, perhaps. And then when Krasner won, Ted and I just decided on a lark to just keep showing up to his office. It was so much chaos over there that they didn't have really any plan or media strategy. And so Ted had an office across the street. We would put on kind of sport jackets, ties, just kind of look like attorneys, like, oh, we belong here. And we had cameras, we had lots of equipment. It was not a secret by any means, but we just showed up kind of every day for about a year. And pretty soon we kind of became part of the furniture there, and people expected to see us. I mean, I think in totality we shot over 560 days when we looked at our log. So it was a lot of filming.
Yeah, this kind of filming, I mean, for people that, are not necessarily familiar, I mean, when you structure your film around interviews and, a certain amount of observation or B-roll, I mean, you can control how much filming you do and, where you go and things like that. When you commit to this kind of filmmaking, it's unending in terms of just capturing moments and finding, and then the editing is, of course, huge as a challenge.
Yeah, we shot for another year after that first year. We shot for 2 years and then edited for almost 8 months with a team of 6 editors to go through all of it. So it was a massive project.
It's a monumental achievement, I think, the series. I've not seen anything like it on television. I mean, it goes back to just decades at PBS. The American Family, the Loud Family.
Yeah, in the early 80s.
And your style of cinematography, because your background is in cinematography, which of course in documentary, especially small team, a cinematographer is acting as a director almost inevitably. Then there's a director. Also the editor sort of inevitably is acting like a director as well. I mean, that's one of the, with really dynamic, especially direct cinema, documentary, I think that's true. So, I think you capture moments and you're very obviously quick on your feet because you're creating almost the impact of narrative, development and continuity with tight filming. So this person's talking, this person's reacting. You build scenes that really are interactive effectively. So how do you approach that? What's the secret? What's the drive? What turned you on to it?
I don't know if there's a secret, but I would say that the importance of, I think, for me shooting the films that I direct, which I don't do all the time, but I really love to, is making quick decisions. For example, decisions about character and about story. So, for example, in that scene in episode 2, where Dion Lawrence, whose son was murdered, confronts Krasner and says, how could you let this happen? You being the criminal justice system. How could you fail her? I had only about 15 seconds to decide how to shoot that because, we saw Krasner, we saw Dion, we're like, Krasner, can you go talk to her? It was like a very quick thing that we orchestrated to get that scene, and then had to really decide within a few seconds, well, how should this scene be shot? Like, what's important in this moment? And I had been filming Larry at that point for a year. I had filmed enough of his face, and so it was a quick decision to not get any cutaways of him, essentially, and let her be the person who was talking, with the camera direct address. And when it came time to get a cutaway, because I knew I'd need to edit something, remembering, Isaac and his brothers, who we had played basketball with the week before, and making sure I got a shot of them watching his mother confront the district attorney. So it's those kind of like quick decisions where I'm thinking about the scenes we've shot, who are the characters, what is their objective, character objective.
Right.
That's important.
Sure.
The other thing I'll say about cinematography is sound is so important.
I'm just going to say sound.
Yeah.
Do you record your own sound? No. You have a separate sound person.
That's why, speaking of Frederick Wiseman, I think I read something that he said that he doesn't shoot, he records sound when he's directing, and he uses his boom pole as like an orchestra, a wand that a conductor would hold. And we kind of emulated that because my co-director Ted would usually run sound in all those meetings. We didn't use any wireless microphones because, as you can imagine, in law enforcement, wearing a wire is a thing. And so nobody had microphones on. Everything was booms that were like inches from their face. And the boom was more important. Getting good sound is way more important in a project like this than getting good images. And so I would let Ted often, direct me to what was important to shoot. Mm-hmm. And we would look at each other, and we had a whole kind of dance about like, okay, this person in the corner really wants to say something. This person is really has had enough. We don't need to focus on them. So there was a real dialogue between myself or Ted, or myself and Nicole.
So it's sort of a choreography.
Yeah, very much.
How big was the camera? What camera were you using, and how large was it, and how heavy was it?
We used sort of just like the standard documentary camera of that time period, which is like the Canon C300 Mark II, so it's about that big.
So not terribly burdensome.
Not huge.
Yeah. You know, I mean, and you were involved in the editing as well. What were the big challenges in terms of constructing it? How long did the editing take?
Yeah, I think about 8 or 9 months. I mean, the whole process of figuring out how to make this a feature, which should it be? It's not a short for sure. Feature film we thought about doing, but then how do you boil? Once we got into the office and saw what a prosecutor does, and forget whether it's Larry Krasner in Philadelphia or a more traditional prosecutor, it's very rare to film inside of an office. They don't have much incentive to let cameras in. These guys did. They wanted to tell this story. It wasn't necessarily the story we wanted to tell. We realized that the prosecutor's office touches so many different aspects of the criminal legal system, the death penalty, the juvenile justice system, plus their own personal stories of the people doing it, that we had to take multiple episodes. And we wanted there to be a series-wide arc. Mm-hmm. So things that happen to characters in episodes 1 and 2 change in episodes 3, 4, and 5. And you'll see that with Larry Krasner. I think if you watch episode 1, you might think like, man, these guys are in love with that guy. Like, he's just like a hero. I think if you watch episode 6, you'll see that we're also exposing some of his fallibilities as a leader, as a politician. So we wanted to use the series format to do something that a feature couldn't do, which is show multiple characters changing over time, with each episode concentrated on a different kind of aspect of the criminal legal system.
I think it does that. I mean, good documentaries are driven by multi-dimensional, interesting characters, and you have more than one. I mean, the characters come on pretty full-blown. There's a lot of fairly close coverage on, you know, just you see the faces, you see the process going on, you see the subtext, you see the emotion and all of that. And that's what really brings it to life. It's got a lot of immediacy. It's got a lot of sizzle, it crackles, which is really, you know, quite important for it. Now, you received a Peabody Award. Was it for this?
Yes.
Yeah. Which is, of course, very prestigious recognition in the field of journalism or, media in general. In fact, Erica Heilman, who does radio for Vermont Public, just got a Peabody Award this last year. In any case, we are somewhat limited in time because we have to go to a workshop on documentary filmmaking. But let's take a question or two if anybody has one. Anybody wants? Sure.
I'm interested to know whether there were times that you felt that with the mood in the room, the camera in the room, whether you were almost influencing what was happening. You know, there were times where there were a lot of people you felt like they wanted to say something that they might not have done.
Yeah, we had a really interesting dynamic with filming those meetings. A lot of them were, we shot probably 100 more meetings that are in the film, that are not in the film. Some of them, I think, were even better in these meetings, more intense, but they didn't map onto storylines, for example. And we had a dynamic that we developed on the fly, which is that anybody in the room could ask us to turn off our cameras. And often that was because they were going to insult somebody ad hominem and talk about a judge who was sleeping with this. Like you can imagine the things that a bunch of lawyers say to each other. And they would just say, guys, turn this off for a minute. And we would we would put our cameras down, boom would come off. I left the red light on my camera all the time, which I would normally never do, but I wanted them to know the cameras were not on. I wasn't like trying to sneak one out on them. And I think that engendered a lot of trust. They also knew that we were hearing those things, the gossip, and not leaking it. So it didn't end up in the paper the next day. That being said, I don't know because I was never in meetings that I wasn't in, if that makes sense. But I did hear from other attorneys that they thought people were being performative sometimes for us, and that it kind of broke my heart, but then I thought, of course they are. They're defense attorneys and prosecutors, like they're actors.
We have one other question. Yeah. What kind of archival footage was important and selected, and how it played into the overall visual and informational arc?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think a very different series should be made about the criminal legal system in Philadelphia from a purely historical lens. So I think we didn't want to make the historical film, but we also felt like you needed to have some context to understand a little bit of how we got this way. And there's way more that could, America's first penitentiary is in Philadelphia. There's lots more interesting things you can talk about. But I will say that Philadelphia is blessed to have a really good archive at Temple University, the Urban Archives, where a lot of those tapes, for example, from the MOVE bombing in 1985 are housed. There are other repositories and community groups that have been filming protests over the years that, again, I think because we all lived in Philadelphia, at least Ted and myself, had pre-existing relationships with either the university and also local artists and filmmakers who collected some of those early black and white photos of the district attorney's office. That's really the Philadelphia district attorney's office in the 60s, when Arlen Specter, future US Senator, was there. So we were able to, I think, have relationships with local people who, you can't get that stuff online, but you have to know who to talk to. And it's just, for me, another reason why I think making films where you live and where you have those existing relationships can help.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground in a very short time. I wish we could talk longer, but we have to go to this next workshop. But we also want to present Yoni with our Vermont B. Teddy Award for excellence.
Thank you so much. Wow. Too bad my kids aren't here to see this. This is not for you kids. This is my Teddy Award. Just kidding. Thank you so much.
Thank you.